Well, our speaker tonight is Peter Connolly, and this is Peter's third talk for Dorset Humanists. You may have heard the earlier ones. His first talk was on the philosophy of truth, and his second talk was on influence and persuasion. And tonight he's going to try and persuade us that revenge is okay. So you may have someone in mind who you're going to get back to or with or whatever. Peter was a senior lecturer in religious studies at the University of Chichester, and his latest book, Understanding Religious Experience, can be borrowed from our Dorset Humanist library, but that is in our Moordown Community Centre hall. So without further ado, will you please give Peter a very warm welcome.
I've got a few slides to go with my notes, which I will need to refer to. This is the first time I've given this talk, because it was a kind of impromptu sort of talk in response to last year's bulletin where David summarised Philip Nathan's 52 principles for humanists to follow. And as I read through those, I started to become a little bit uneasy. Echoes of my primary school exposure to the Roman Catholic Catechism, perhaps. There seemed to be resonances there. And when I arrived at number 12, which was essentially abjure revenge, I thought, always, is there never any circumstances where revenge is a good thing? And then I put it to one side, but it remained an itch that I needed to scratch. So I put these notes down as a kind of justification for rejecting that principle 12 that Philip Nathan offered. And I hope to persuade you, as David said, that in certain circumstances, revenge is actually a good thing. When I first ran this talk past my wife, she said, yes, very interesting, rather dry and boring. Can you lighten it up and add a bit of humour? It's not easy to bring in humour to a topic like this, and I did struggle to find quips and jokes to insert into it. Eventually I gave up. But what I did instead was attempt to insert a few provocative expressions and ideas into the talk in the hope that that would provide you with a bit of an itch that you wanted to scratch in the form of quizzing me and challenging some of these ideas that I'm putting across. So my hope is that I'll be able to provoke you enough for us to have an interesting discussion at the end of my talk. Okay, so the basic structure of the talk is in these parts. The first bit is probably the driest bit, so I'll skip through that fairly quickly. These are the substantial parts of the talk, but running through is what I would call a theme, a kind of question that I'd like to come back to again and again, and it has to do with this definition of humanism down here. Unfortunately, I can't read it. And if you wouldn't mind, David, because I don't want to take this microphone out of here. It's got the latest technology of elastic bands holding it in place, and I don't want to disturb that.
Well, okay, well, if that's helpful. This is it's called the IHEU Minimum Statement on Humanism. IHEU is now called Humanists International, which is a much better name. So it says, humanism is a democratic and ethical life stance that affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their own lives. Humanism stands for the building of a more humane society through an ethics based on human and other natural values in a spirit of reason and free inquiry through human capabilities. Humanism is not theistic and it does not accept supernatural views of reality. My view of that is that it's the sort of thing that's been put together by a committee, but there's some good stuff in there. But anyway, I'll let Peter comment on it.
Thank you, David. The heart of that for me, or at least one of the core components of that, is the free and rational inquiry. In other words, being a humanist involves a willingness to take part in a conversation that largely is evidence-based. We are looking for ways to improve human lives, improve all lives really, make the world a better place. But that's a process. We haven't got the formula yet. And so I'm rather hesitant to take on board something like Philip Nason's 52 Principles as a kind of bedrock for my humanist identity. And indeed, this evening I hope to persuade you that at least one of them, I think there are more, but one of them, number 12, Abjure Revenge, not quite the right wording, but that's what it means, is misguided. That's what I'll aim to do. He chose to use the term principles, and I thought 52 is a rather large number for principles if I know how native speakers of English use that word. So I looked in the shorter Oxford Dictionary, and they give a variety of meanings to the idea of principle. I picked out what I regard as the kind of core notion behind the principle, a fundamental proposition that is essential and general, on which others depend or from which others are derived and which determine or at least guide actions. So principles are your foundational ideas from which you build your system of thought or your system of morality or whatever it might be. And 52 seems a rather large number for foundational principles upon which others are going to be built. You're going to end up with at least 150 and probably more in terms of the complete list, and I think that's rather dodgy. Yeah. I've just put a few up here, and this slideshow will be available if you're interested in getting the details. David can send it out to you or post it on the website. These are just a few that I thought were rather idiosyncratic and hardly warrant the status of principles. So the 52 constitute, to my mind, a rather mixed bag of ideas that humanists should give fair consideration to, but with a fair degree of caution. That would be my statement on them. So let's move on to Principle 12, Abjure Revenge. Philosophers disagree amongst themselves about the moral status of revenge. Some, particularly social philosophers, tend to regard it as a kind of primitive, atavistic fall back into an earlier stage of civilization, though there are a substantial number, primarily those who work on retributivist theories of justice, which essentially say that if somebody commits a harm to somebody else, then they should be punished for that harm. They should have a roughly equivalent harm applied to them as a penalty for the original crime. And that's a kind of social version of revenge. I would call it revenge-based justice, and I'll explain why it's important that society, or as a number of psychologists and philosophers call it, the Leviathan, the controlling state, why it's important for them to get the balance right, to ensure that the revenge element is there and it's also proportionate to the circumstances in which the crime or harm was committed. I'll come back to that in a little while. So I'm going to move on now to acknowledge that revenge is a problematic concept. And it can have quite negative effects on people and society. So it's not an unalloyed good, and I'm not claiming that it is. Philosophers, as I said, tend to talk about revenge in the context of justice. Psychologists tend to be a bit less hesitant in that area, and so I'm going to quote a few of their works that kind of jump in and tackle the problem head on. First of all, I'd like to draw your attention to the work of a social psychologist called Roy Baumeister. He wrote a book called Evil, Inside Human Violence and Cruelty. It's an excellent book, I recommend it. In one of his sections, he focuses on the different perspectives of victims and perpetrators to harms and crimes. So, for example, victims of crimes tend to be more profoundly affected by the crime than the perpetrator. It makes sense. If I punch David in the face, my knuckles might hurt a bit, but his jaw will hurt a lot more. He's affected more powerfully. If I steal his money, then, there's no harm to me whatsoever, but David suffers completely. So there is an asymmetry in the experience of perpetrators and victims. The impact of the crime or the harm also tends to stay longer in the minds and emotions of victims than it does perpetrators. Perpetrators often think, oh, well, I only pinched his wallet, what's the problem? But that could be a very upsetting experience for a whole variety of reasons for the person whose wallet has been stolen. So again, there's an asymmetry of impact. And thirdly, and perhaps most relevant to this talk, the memory of the event tends to persist much longer in the minds of victims than it does in the minds of perpetrators. And that means, put those three together, that the victim's judgment of the magnitude of the crime tends to be far higher than that of the perpetrator. So if I hit David in the face, then, he probably deserved a thump. But for David, it's an assault that's caused him considerable physical and emotional harm. So there's a big kind of difference. So if someone then said, well, how do you think you should be punished for David hitting you in the face? And I say, okay, well, I'll be quarantined for the weekend. David might think, well, actually, that punishment is far, far lower than what would be appropriate for the magnitude of the crime. So our judgments about how big a crime it was or how big an harm it was are going to be very different. So, if David or his gang of friends decide to restore the balance and inflict some kind of punishment on me for the crime I committed against him, are they going to go for my recommendation of a weekend in quarantine or his recommendation that I get a damn good drubbing. Not only thumped in the face like I did to him, but because I instigated the harm, there needs to be some additional punishment as well, because I initiated the crime. So a thump in the face and maybe a clonk on the head as well. Now, I, thinking a quarantine for the weekend is an appropriate punishment, would think that what he and his friends have done is far in excess of what is appropriate. So I tell my friends and they agree with me, and so they decide to attack David's friends. And then David's friends go and get some more friends, and then you've got what we find in many parts of the world, vendettas. And these can go on for generations. Now, this is all coming out of revenge and the different perspectives of victims and perpetrators. So you can end up with a vicious circle that causes a lot of harm to a lot of people over a long period of time. It's a real problem. Here's one of my hopefully provocative bits. I think if you take that kind of scenario into the realm of what is currently called identity politics, where people's identity is conceived of in terms of their membership of particular groups, then quite an ugly new twist can come into play. The identity politics perspective of group identities being primary, I would argue, is quite fundamentally inconsistent with a humanist outlook, which I tend to think is appropriately complemented with what we could loosely call liberal democracy, which emphasizes human rights, the rights of individuals to realize their own potential, and also that individuals, rather than families or other groups within which they are embedded, are themselves the people who are responsible for crimes. That is well expressed, I think, in a famous statement by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963. He expressed his hope that one day his children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, i.e. their group identity, but by the content of their character, their individual character. In the context of identity politics and revenge, it's very easy to slip into regarding groups as homogeneous. And if one member of a group is harmed by someone from another group, and you can't get access to that person, it's not too much of a problem, because if groups are homogeneous, then revenge inflicted on any member of that group is appropriate, because all the groups represent each other equally, all the members of the group rather. And I think something like that was behind the bombing of the mosque in New Zealand. The guy who did that justified it by saying he was seeking revenge for some Muslims attacking a girl in Sweden. So he wasn't after the Muslims in Sweden, he was in New Zealand, but he thought, well, to get back at the people, the group, who attacked this girl in Sweden, he'd kill some Muslims in New Zealand. This falls into what the philosopher Jeffrey Ryman calls symmetric valuing. I'll just unpack this a little bit, because I think it is quite a useful concept. He says a symmetric valuing of something allows for it to be replaced by another one. So if I damage your CD or your iPod or run down your sheep, I can give you another one in replacement and we're all pretty equal. But, says Ryman, human beings do not have symmetric value. We have asymmetric value, primarily because each one of us is an individual in our own right. And if I kill David, it's no good me saying, well, I've got another guy here who's the same age and wears the same glasses, have him instead. No, that doesn't work, because David is a unique individual with asymmetric value. And one of the dangers of identity politics is it tends to treat group members as though they have symmetric value, and I think there are many moral problems that arise out of that kind of move. So, revenge can generate quite undesirable outcomes. There's no doubt about that, and I could give you lots more examples. But it doesn't always have to do that. And in fact, under circumstances, I think there are good reasons for embracing revenge as a social good. And that's what I'll move on to now. I'll try and unpack that and persuade you of its truth. Excuse me one second. Okay, first of all, I want to introduce a simple kind of rough, crude measuring device that has its home in moral philosophy. There are different, if you will, schools or groups of moral philosophers. Ones who often go under the name of virtue theorists tend to put the emphasis on the intention of the actor or the character of the actor. Deontologists, those who emphasize the importance of duty or right action, emphasize the nature or character of the act itself, and others, most famously utilitarians, tend to concentrate on the consequences of actions. So when somebody engages in a morally questionable activity, we can judge it by these three sets of criteria. Was the person's intention a good one? Was the action itself a good one? Were the consequences good ones? And if you can say yes to all three, then you can be pretty confident that the action itself was a good one, was morally sound. If you only have one, it might be a little dodgy. A famous saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, if you take that line, then however good your intentions are, if your action is irredeemably bad and the consequences are bad also, then by and large most of us would judge the actions to be immoral. So now I'm going to introduce a revenge scenario and ask you to judge the actions of the avenger according to these three sets of criteria. And I also, because with the theme of the underlying the talk, ask you to think about what, as humanists, do we make of these actions, and particularly, are we all in agreement? Because if we're not, then we're back to this statement of humanism that we then have to engage in rigorous rational inquiry in order to move forward on those kind of judgments. Okay, so how best to illustrate this? And I slept on it a while, and just popped up in my mind when I woke up the next morning, Death Wish. For those of you who know it, the original Death Wish movie was 1974, with Charles Bronson in the lead role, and more recently it was remade with Bruce Willis in that role in 2018. It's clearly a revenge movie. Baumeister, the guy I mentioned earlier, describes it as the first in a popular series of revenge films. They go down in quality with each one. I think they got to about Death Wish 5. Death Wish 2 was pretty good, but then the scale really dropped down. But the original 1974 Death Wish received quite good reviews from both critics and also audiences in general. I've got a couple of statistics here. I'll just outline the basic plot of the movie for those of you who haven't come across it before. In the 2018 version, the central character is an accident and emergency surgeon played by Bruce Willis, who spends most of his working life helping other people. His wife is murdered and his daughter put into a coma by burglars who broke into his house. The police are unable to identify the perpetrators, and Willis, unable to sleep or rest properly, has to take time off work and go for therapy. On his return to work, something happens that we might call luck. During a search through the belongings of a gunshot victim, Willis discovers photographs of his personal details taken just prior to the burglary by a car valet. He puts two and two together and goes in search of the valet's contacts. This is where the moral ambiguities kick in. The police had been unable to locate the perpetrators of the crimes against his family. So, should he have gone to the police with this information? As it happens, he thought, well, they haven't had much success, and I want to make sure these people get their just desserts, so he goes after them himself. So, was he wrong in deciding that the police who had been ineffective so far weren't going to do the job, so he'd better do it himself? Was that an immoral decision? If you think it was, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. A few chin scratches, keep it coming up if you think it was immoral. 4. So most of you think that his decision to, and you're humanists, to ignore Philip Nathan's Principle 12 and go after the criminals himself was by and large a morally good decision. Okay, we'll leave it there and see, we'll come back to that shortly.
Still not convinced.
I'm sorry?
Not convinced. Not convinced.
You're not convinced of what?
That it was a moral decision.
It was, no.
For me it wasn't. He should have gone to the police with the evidence.
Okay, I understand that, and you're certainly entitled to your opinion. I just remind you at this moment in time that you are in a minority. Now, the group isn't always right. Sometimes the majority get things wrong. That's why I think democratic societies or there's more to democratic societies than simple majority voting. Other factors come into play as well, and you're entitled to your opinion, and you'll have the opportunity to argue against some of your fellow humanists and try to persuade them over to your way of thinking.
Maybe I'll change by the end.
Oh, you might change your own mind, which is great. I think that's a great attitude. I try to adopt it myself whenever I can. I find it difficult. Most of us do find it difficult to change our minds. Usually I need to sleep on it. I tried to accelerate it a bit some years ago teaching university students. I said, if you can get me to change my mind, I'll buy you a bar of chocolate to motivate them. And over the years I did buy quite a few bars of chocolate. So that was a good sign from my point of view. Okay. So let's just use these three criteria that I mentioned. Was Willis playing someone of bad character? If you think he was, raise your hand. Nobody does. He was an accident and emergency doctor helping people all the time. Was his intention to seek revenge a bad intention? Well, we've already had a vote on that. Were his acts of killing his wife's murderers immoral? If you think they were, raise your hand. 1, 2, a bit more this time. So the act is taking, but we're still split roughly 50-50 now. We'll see what this next one generates. Were the consequences of his actions, the taking out of existence of his wife's murderers, were those consequences morally good or were they morally bad? The world is now -3 evil murderers. Is that good or is it bad? If you think it's good, raise your hand.
And all those very consequences.
And if, what did I say then? If you think it's good, raise your hand, and if you think it's bad, raise your hand. So there's quite a bit of, shall I go through this again? Is the fact that the 3 killers were themselves killed a good thing, a good consequence, or is it a bad consequence? If you think it's a good consequence that these 3 killers are exterminated, if you think that's the case, raise your hand. If you think it's good, raise your hand. Okay, right? And if you think it's bad, raise your hand. That's a nice 50-50 split. I love that kind of thing. It does give hope that we'll have some interesting discussion towards the end. But I think that, again, back to the theme. On each of these criteria, you, a mixed humanist group, have quite differing judgments about revenge in terms of the intentions to obtain revenge, the act of getting revenge, and the outcomes or consequences of so doing. So there's still plenty to debate, I think, and to throw revenge out of the window as a bad thing that no humanist should ever contemplate, I think is at the very least premature. And I think your judgments here and now have demonstrated that. But I'd like to go a little bit further. See if I can kind of ram the point home a little bit more. Yeah, just a little bit of research I did on this, and again I'll move into something that could be potentially provocative. I went to a website called Rotten Tomatoes. Some of you may know it, where they review movies and so on and so forth. And the tomatometer that does this measuring showed for the 1974 version a 65% approval rating from critics and a 67% approval rating from general audiences. So critics and general audiences were pretty much in agreement that this was a good movie. And the moral issue that it raises and follows through, that essentially revenge is a good thing, everybody felt happy when he killed his wife's killers, that's okay. When it comes to the 2018 movie, however, there was a big gap between critics and general audiences. Critics gave it 31%. Audiences, well, they were asked to grade on a A to F scale, and the average grading was B+. So there's a big difference this time with the 2018 film. Just came in my mind, since we've just gone through the first stage of Brexit, that there is perhaps here a reflection of a kind of populist and elitist divide on moral issues. And so I just wondered, are the critics, the intellectually educated aesthetes and moral guardians of our social exposure to different ideas, are they leading a vanguard into an even higher, more enlightened ethic, leaving the hoi polloi behind? Or are they blinded by their current ideological predilections, and in fact the popular people have their feet on the ground and are still making good decisions in the sphere of morality? I remember talking to a woman in an Open University seminar some years ago, and she was saying, oh, in a democratic society, we all agree on the basic principles of justice. And I said, well, no, the majority of people in this country still would like to bring back the death penalty for certain kinds of crimes. It's not going to happen in the immediate future, but that tends to be the popular opinion, and like the judgments about this 2018 film, it creates a disconnect between what you might call the intellectual elite and the populace at large. So there are quite a number of these things reverberating around in society. It may be that these kind of issues, the death penalty and revenge, also split humanists into different camps. Okay. Yeah, quite a few of the critics brought attention to wooden acting. The acting wasn't the highest quality, but many of them did comment on the moral issue, but unlike the earlier critics, they were more condemnatory. So you get things like, the film was pandering shamelessly to the viewer's bloodlust. Another said, it gave me a guilty pleasure. But the film's director, Eli Roth, put the moral issue right at the heart of the movie. He said, the movie for me is about family and protecting your family and what you do when you can't get justice. And that comes back to the general theme that I'm developing here, that if society, if the Leviathan, if the state cannot get justice for you, then it may well be the case that getting it for yourself is a good thing. My last leg of the talk is based largely on two works by the psychologist and linguist Steven Pinker. Some of you may be acquainted with them, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and to a lesser extent, Enlightenment Now. In these books, Pinker addresses the issue of revenge quite extensively, though it's embedded in his comments on a variety of other topics. But two lines of approach I've teased out as being particularly prominent. One is what, following Norman Elias, he calls the civilizing process, and the other is his comments on the prisoner's dilemma scenario. So I want to tease out what he says about revenge in the context of these principles. Pinker presents the civilizing process of the second of 6 trends that he says have reduced violence across the world. At the heart of it are what he calls Leviathan, which is the state. Thomas Hobbes came up with that term as a title of one of his books, and also commerce. Leviathan is the state's monopoly on the use of force. So if force is required in functioning Leviathan, only the state is allowed to apply it. Commerce, I think, speaks for itself. People who trade with each other are much less likely to come to blows or go to war than states that don't. He calls these the two triggers of the civilization process. However, he says a Leviathan can civilize a society only when the citizens feel that its laws, law enforcement and other social arrangements are legitimate, so they don't fall back on their worst impulses as soon as Leviathan's back is turned. And I think we can surely add to that when Leviathan is ineffective, as is the case with the Death Wish movies. One of these worst impulses is revenge, and we've seen why revenge can be so destructive when it leads to vendetta violence that goes on generation after generation. One of the main ways in which Leviathan is able to become effective and subdue this impulse to revenge is to deliver revenge under the heading of justice. So, when one person has harmed another, we want at least an equal response from society. People often complain when they're interviewed outside courts and they feel that a perpetrator of a crime has been given a sentence that is too light, and they say we haven't had justice. In other words, there's no balance between the nature of the crime and the punishment inflicted by the state. Now we know behind some of that is this asymmetry between the victim and the perpetrator's perspective. But sometimes there's a broad consensus that certain punishments are too lenient, and it's not unheard of for the Home Secretary to recommend increasing the length of time someone stays in prison, or increasing a fine or something of that kind. Just to reiterate a point I made earlier, the philosopher John Hospice says if a man steals $50 from another, then few people would say that the punishment for that should be an exact equivalence. In other words, the thief pays $50 back. If this were the only punishment, he says, it would deter no one, for if a thief were caught, he would lose nothing but the $50 he had just taken. And if he were not caught, he would be the gainer by $50. So how does one reach an equivalence? That's a problem. So Leviathan's primary role is to get that balance right, to deliver revenge on the part of the victim in a way that friends or supporters of the perpetrator can regard as appropriate. And there's always going to be some disagreement here, but nevertheless, if Leviathan, if the state does that job reasonably well, then nobody's going to kick up too much of a fuss. Pinker goes on to say, revenge can work only as a deterrent only if the avenger has a reputation for being willing to avenge and a willingness to carry it out even when it is costly. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are credited with always getting their man, and this surely enhances their reputation in this regard. So if you're a Canadian and you're told the Royal Mounted Police are on the case, then you can feel reasonably reassured because you know, or at least you are told, that they always get their man. And as Cesare Beccaria pointed out in his book Crimes and Punishments in 1764, the greatest deterrent effect comes not from severe punishments, but on the likelihood of being apprehended. In other words, if you're highly likely to be caught, you're less likely to commit a crime than if you're going to have your head chopped off if you are caught. Severity of punishment doesn't have a strong deterrent effect. So, when states can deliver punishment in this balanced way, most people will tend to accept that and forego their right to personal revenge. But when Leviathan cannot deliver, as in the Death Wish films, then personal revenge comes back on the agenda by way of default. And in those circumstances, it seems to me that it has the same moral status as the state delivering revenge, because the state has been unable to deliver, and what revenge is doing, or what justice is doing, is restoring the balance between victim and perpetrator through the administration of punishment. And if the state can't do it, then the victim or the victim's supporters, I would say, have a legitimate case for doing it themselves. I recently read an interesting book called Why the West Doesn't Win Wars and What We Can Do About It, by an intelligence writer called Sean McFate. Within it is a short section dealing with what he calls a war without states. Now, in the West, we're accustomed to thinking of war as something a state declares on another. A classic example is, what was the Prime Minister before Churchill, the Second World War? Chamberlain's statement that if we do not receive an assurance by 11 o'clock, then we will be at war with Germany. So it's a kind of state thing. And that's how philosophers tend to think about and write about and debate about war in the modern world. What McFate is doing is saying that's only a small part of war. War is a much fuzzier kind of area than philosophers tend to make out. And a lot of war doesn't fall neatly into those kind of boxes. And he comments on Mexico's ongoing conflict with drug cartels. He cites the example of farmers in the state of Michoacan. The cartels had dominated the area through violence and extortion. A tipping point was reached and the farmers fought back. They set up cordons around towns and hunted down cartel members and killed them. Now, a number of philosophers who write about war and murder and stuff, Brian Orend is one. You can find his work if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's free online. You can see his articles on this. He would regard what those farmers did as mass murder, because the cartel were not the forces of a state, but merely criminal gangs. But for McFate, it's what he calls a war without states. And on his definition, those farmers were not murderers, and their killing was a good thing, not only permissible, but in fact desirable. The consequences, lots of dead cartel criminals, was a good thing, not a bad thing. And my personal response, so again, hoping you'll come back on me, is one of approval for the farmers. I think what they did was good. I judge their intentions to be good, I judge their actions to be good, and I judge the consequences of those actions to be good. And I still think I'm a humanist. Okay, so the second approach adopted by Pinker to the topic of revenge is to look at a scenario that most of you are probably familiar with, which is called the prisoner's dilemma. Here's a quick summary. Well, let me just check. Is there anyone who hasn't come across the prisoner's dilemma who doesn't know how it plays out? Quite a few. Okay, I'll give you a quick summary. I'll quote from Richard Dawkins' account of it because it's quite clear and concise, and then expand on that. So this is the grid to understand the basic categories. Two men, call them Peterson and Moriarty, are in jail, suspected of collaborating in a crime. Each prisoner in his separate cell is invited to betray his colleague. That's called defect. Do the dirty on your colleague. And turn King's evidence against him. What happens depends on what both prisoners do, and neither knows what the other has done. If Peterson throws the blame entirely on Moriarty, and Moriarty renders the story plausible by remaining silent, by cooperating with his colleague, his treacherous colleague in fact, Moriarty gets a heavy jail sentence while Peterson gets off scot-free. While Peterson gets off scot-free, having yielded to the temptation to defect. If each betrays the other, both are convicted of the crime but receive some credit for giving evidence and get a somewhat reduced, though still stiff, sentence. The punishment for mutual defection. If both cooperate with each other, not with the authorities, by refusing to speak, there is not enough evidence to convict either of them of the main crime, and they receive a small sentence for a lesser offence, the reward for mutual cooperation. So it's clear that if both of them keep silent, that is the best option. But if you keep silent and your friend, colleague, partner in crime blames it on you, you get the full whack and 10 years in prison. Is it worth the gamble? Is your friend really that trustworthy? For many people, no. So they blame each other and get a stiff sentence, when if they could have only kept their mouths shut, they'd have got away with 6 months instead of 5 years. So this is a one-off prisoner's dilemma situation. And as many commentators have pointed out, real life is full of prisoner's dilemma type scenarios. Matt Ridley suggests, I quote, "Any situation in which you are tempted to do something but know it would be a great mistake if everybody did the same thing is likely to be a prisoner's dilemma." Now, in real life, many of these prisoner's dilemma scenarios are, in fact, one-off encounters. So that's why a confidence trickster will usually start by putting his trust in you. Please, hold my wallet for me. I think you're a trustworthy person. Turn away, do something. Can I have my wallet back? No, let me hold your wallet. Well, he's put his trust in you. It will be offensive if you don't put your trust in him. I mean, that's a simplified scenario, but that's at the root of many forms of confidence trickery. But many prisoner's dilemma scenarios are not one-off. They repeat themselves. They are iterated, as the scholars say. And it may well be the case, and in fact it has been shown to be the case, that for iterated prisoner's dilemma scenarios, always defect is not the optimum strategy. And the political scientist Robert Axelrod organised a computer-based iterated Prisoner's Dilemma tournament. Some of you probably heard of this, and invited people to submit computer programs that would play the Prisoner's Dilemma game, and they would accrue points depending on how well they performed at each round. And they played each other 200 times, these different programs, and some didn't do very well, some did quite a bit better, and one did really, really well. This was submitted by a computer scientist called Anatole Rappaport, and it was very simple. He called it tit for tat. In other words, on the first move it offered cooperation, and then it simply did what the other player did in response, tit for tat. He then invited other programmers to write programs that could beat tit for tat. 62 programmers tried, and tit for tat beat them all. Then, this is the interesting bit for our purposes, instead of getting points, programs generated offspring, clones like them. So instead of 10 points, it got 10 babies. If it got 5 points, it got 5 babies. So you can see the situation in terms of living organisms, in terms of differential population growth. Successful programs at tit for tat become more prevalent in the population. Programs that were very unsuccessful went extinct. Tit for tat became king of the castle, but not all of the other programs went entirely extinct. There was still a little bit of leeway, and they survived on the margins, as it were. Tit for tat, claims Pinker, is identical to Robert Trivers' theory of the evolution of reciprocal altruism, which some of you might know of. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, which he regards as one of the main foundations for non-kin cooperation. Trivers' theory of reciprocal altruism. Trivers' theory that the moral emotions or adaptations to cooperation can be translated directly into the tit-for-tat algorithm. Vengeance is no disease. It is necessary for cooperation, preventing a nice guy from being exploited. Many other Prisoner's Dilemmas tournaments followed these. One of them was called Public Goods Games. Everybody had to chip in a certain amount for certain public goods, like a park or a school or a theatre or so on and so forth. So the contributions you make, just like the contributions you make in the bowl at the back of the room tonight, benefit everybody. Your generosity spreads out and does good work beyond this room. But the challenge comes in the form of individuals who try to be free riders, who contribute less than everybody else, but reap the same benefits as everybody else. And it came to me as I was writing this, and this might be provocative too, a contemporary example might be seen in the government's forthcoming organ donation programme. People who opt out of being donors of their organs can still nevertheless be recipients of organs donated by others. A classic invitation to being a free rider. I'll take the benefits without making the contribution. Now, one solution to the problem of free riding is to punish people who do it. And with regard to organ donation, I think the simplest solution would be, this is a scheme that you buy into, both donating and receiving. If you don't donate, you don't receive. that would be the kind of scenario that would deal with free riding. But I'm sure many people in our society, and indeed some of you in this room, may well think that you should be able to benefit from the donations of others without contributing to the scheme yourself. Now, whether that's an immoral or a moral position, well, we can discuss that later on. But punishing free riders tends to discourage free riding, which many of us might think is quite a good thing. Oops, missed something. So, as these tournaments multiplied and they ran for longer, something quite strange started to happen. The world started to become nicer. As tit for tat started to rule the roost, there was plenty of space for nicer programs, such as Always Cooperate, or tit for two tats, which is very similar to turn the other cheek in the Christian religion. So the world, in the computer scenario, when people played according to tit for tat, the world got nicer. And you could, tit for two tats or even always cooperate. Things seemed to be getting better. But then there was a twist. As the nicer programs like tit for two tats started to flourish, so did some other programs like Mr. Nasty Always Defect. Always Defect was able to prey on tit for two tats because he never got slapped back. So then the Always Defect reduced the number of Always Cooperate and tit for two tats, so they went down in numbers until the point came where the Always Defect started to encounter tit for tat more often, and then they got pushed back by tit for tat and pushed out to the margins. But then when tit for tat reached a tipping point and the nicer programs started to multiply, so too did the programs that fed upon them. And as Matt Ridley said, there is no end to the game. Just as you think the world is becoming utopia, the predators, the psychopaths, the free riders start to take advantage of Mr. and Mrs. Nice, and they explode their numbers in the population. So Pinker shows that various changes that have been made over the centuries have helped to reduce violence, personal revenge, and interminable vendettas. But he is far from arguing that we should abandon revenge-based justice. Indeed, the abandonment of what I would call tit-for-tat revenge-based strategies would put the gains of violence reduction documented by Pinker into reversal. Leviathan needs to ensure that perpetrators of crimes are caught and punished in an appropriate manner. It needs to deliver revenge/justice as far as both victims and perpetrators are concerned, and that justice is both certain and proportionate. So, to come back to my theme to finish, should humanists abandon the pursuit of revenge? I think there are good reasons for being cautious, and it seems to me that if we completely abandon revenge-based justice, the consequences for our society could be catastrophic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, I'm sure we're going to have a bit of a discussion on some of those points. So Pat is going to go around with the microphone. So if you have a question, just pop your hand up and just try to speak into the mic the way I'm doing that. Okay. Thank you.
was particularly fascinated with which is actually quite obvious, but just the point you made between justice and revenge. And to me, you can extend that as well to human versus humanist. We all have a certain baseline of functioning and human emotions. So there is so I would say justice is the intellect, revenge is the emotions.
Yeah.
You know, humans, emotions, humanists, intellect. So first of all, I'd like to say I found that really fascinating. Anyway, to just sort of have that suddenly reiterated to me, or just have that flash of recognition. So I found that really interesting, so thank you very much.
Okay.
The other thing that I wanted to say as well is there, so we're talking about justice or revenge, so we're talking about retribution in one way or another.
Well, not everybody does, I can comment on that.
What about magnanimity? Where does that come into the issue? Where is forgiving, generosity, magnanimity, as a concept, not just as an emotional concept, but as an intellectual concept too.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't know. It just triggered that in me.
Forgiveness, tit for two tats. Yeah, somebody does the dirty on you, you forgive them. Somebody does the dirty again, you forgive them. You might then think, well, I've had enough forgiveness, there's a limit to my magnanimity. But then there's the programs of always cooperate. I'm permanently Mr. Nice Guy. Or you might say a doormat that people can take advantage of. Some people are quite happy doing that. If we think in terms of consequences, if we have a large number of people in our society who approach interactions with that attitude, there are also plenty of people around who are happy to take advantage of them, take their money, their property, their identity, their self-esteem, their dignity, and so on and so forth. Is that, when it's widespread, a good consequence for society? In other words, what these computer programs tend to show us is that whilst there might be a place for magnanimity and forgiveness, those attributes do need to have limits, and quite clear limits set upon them, because if they are implemented without limits, then you'll have a multiplication of people who will take advantage of them, and those kind of people becoming dominant or prominent in our society is probably not a good thing for that society, I would say. So yes, there's a place for it, but again, it has to be within limits. And then on the issue of, I'm talking about tit-for-tat revenge-based justice, which philosophers, jurisprudence people call retributive justice. But there are other approaches to justice, deterrence-based approaches, and certainly for a period in the 1960s, there was a strong move in the philosophy of law, certainly, but also within judicial circles as well. Remember, that's when we had a liberalisation of many laws, abortion, homosexuality and so on. That's when the death penalty was done away with. There was quite a movement supporting the idea that retributivist justice was something a bit kind of primitive, something a little bit crude. It was a sign that people hadn't thought carefully about the issues and so on. And I remember reading a collection of essays on the philosophical issues surrounding justice, and there was one by an Australian philosopher called Armstrong, called The Retributivist Hits Back, which is a nice title. But he made quite a good case for keeping hold of the retributive element in justice. At the beginning of it, he quotes from a novel by Kingsley Amis, I think it was, who describes a woman who, amongst the other things that she disdained, was retributivist justice as something that was kind of primitive and civilized people should never think about. I think many philosophers and jurisprudists, anyway, those people who work on philosophy of law, many of them have changed their mind now, and there's been a rehabilitation of retributivist justice, that if people do bad things, they should be punished for it, not simply deterred from doing it again. And I think certainly for most ordinary people, when they use the term justice, the idea of retributivist justice is what comes to mind, not merely what will deter people from committing crimes again.
Okay, Eric?
Where does rehabilitation fit into this? Is not revenge just an animal instinct? And is there no case where you could say, well, that person who's just killed 20 kids was mentally ill, he was damaged himself, he didn't know what he was doing, and all the other things, all the extreme crimes usually have a mental illness behind them. So where does that fit in? Obviously rehabilitation for those who aren't psychopathic, but other things, rehabilitation.
Well, certainly for the criminally insane, I have no problems with that at all. They need to be kept from the public at large, so they cannot re-offend. Nevertheless, because of their condition, I think the moral thing to do is help them back to normality as much as we are able. So I don't see a problem there. And even with retributivist punishment, I think it's usefully supplemented by forms of rehabilitation. So you might say you put somebody in prison for a couple of years, that's their punishment, they've lost their freedom, they're in a restricted environment and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, if you support them in ways that will enable them to come back in society and live a normal life, then those things should be done to help them. So I'm quite happy with that. But I wouldn't say that rehabilitation without punishment for the non-mentally ill is appropriate. There's got to be the punishment as well.
Has there?
I think so. Otherwise, that you'll certainly have one constituency of people who are very unhappy about it, and that is the victims of their crimes. And there's something also intuitive about the idea that people shouldn't be able to get away with these crimes. So you commit a heinous crime, one or more people are badly harmed by it, and so all the person gets is rehabilitation. In other words, they go on a few courses, they see a therapist, they're trained in new skills, and then they come back in the world and live happily ever after. There seems to be something kind of missing from that, to me, which is, the punishment element. I don't know if you'd like to come back at me on that?
Maybe this time, I'll let others come in.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Okay, let's go to John and then the lady at the back afterwards. So, okay, Ronnie and then John.
I have a sort of specific scenario. I'll try and explain it as well as I can, but bear with me.
Yeah.
So one type of revenge I was thinking of, it's not quite as direct. So if, for example, you have someone and they're coming at you saying maybe you're weak and scrawny, you're not fit enough, or you come from a very poor family, you'll never be successful, or you come from quite a dumb family, you'll never be smart.
This is someone who's demeaning you verbally, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Instead of trying to get directly back at them, you then spend time improving yourself,
Okay.
but with the intention of getting back at them that way, so you can later lord it over them. I have now done this, I am now this. sort of trying to hurt their pride, their ego, you still haven't directly done anything to them. So where on that sort of scale would that lie? Is it still morally right, morally wrong? Does it even still count as some sort of revenge? Because you've still done that with the intention of getting one over on them for the things that they've then done to you.
Okay, well, let's think of those three criteria, and let me ask you, and then I'll give you my response. Do you think that the intention to improve yourself in order to contradict what that person has said is a bad intention?
In a way, it's a good intention to try and improve yourself, but the whole reason you're doing that in the first place is to get back at them, so possibly not.
Okay, well there I would disagree with you. I would say that it is a thoroughly good intention on both counts. Then we've got the action of improving yourself. Is that a good action or a bad action?
Definitely good action.
Definitely good action. And the consequences of improving yourself are twofold. One is that you receive many benefits, and the other person is discomfited in a variety of ways by seeing you succeed. Mm-hmm. Is that a good outcome or is it a bad outcome?
Generally good, I would think.
Okay.
It's more that sort of underlying guilt of them then being sort of wounded, even if you haven't directly done anything.
So you think that their discomfiture at your success is somehow a bad thing? They might learn from it. Not to demean people in the first place.
This is why I pose it, because I'm in so many different minds about it. I thought, definitely get some other views on it.
Yeah. I mean, by and large, as you probably gather from my talk anyway, I would tend to think that the scenario that you just outlined, everything that the person did was good.
Objection,
even
you reframed the question so that your action was a good action for Ronnie rather than a good revenge action against the other person, so you could reframe that either way.
Okay, well let's put both in. A good action for the person who does better for themselves, and simultaneously a good action because the person is discomfited by your success. I would still think all of that is good. Now,
that lowers you to their level.
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think the language of lowering and hiring is not applicable here. What we're talking about is whether it's moral or immoral, and to designate something as immoral, it must fall within the category of unjustified harm, I would say. Now, there's certainly harm, and I would say that that person feeling discomfited at your success is a justifiable harm because it bounces back to them and makes them more aware of their own immoral actions, which were to intentionally demean someone else. That's an unjustifiable harm. So the response with the justifiable harm through your success is good on both counts, I would say.
But they weren't leaving it at that, were they? In Ronnie's scenario, she wasn't leaving it at that. They were going further than just being successful and letting that person absorb that fact. They were rubbing their nose in it.
Yeah. Look at me. I'm successful now. You are not. Well, I mean, it seems to me that, okay, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but there's still nothing essentially wrong in that. Certainly, the amount of harm that you're inflicting on your demeanour, even when you're bragging about your success, is probably less than the harm that they inflicted on you, because the harm that they inflicted on you was such a powerful motivator that you did all this stuff to make yourself more successful, which shows that as a prod, it was a pretty potent one. Yeah. And I can't really see that you bragging about your success is even close to being as potent as the original demeaning comments that that person made.
Let's try and get some more in, rather than just get
Sorry, I tend to go on a little
That's
bit.
fine. So John is waiting, lady at the back, and Sally as well. So.
Hi, it was about the question that arose in the film, that if you have someone who decides that they will take revenge into their own hands, they're not just becoming a different actor, and I don't mean that in a film way, but what they're doing is actually stepping outside the framework of society. So they're creating a new paradigm. They're not actually being bright knights in shining armour. They are denying the paradigm which might have given them justice. The fact that the police are inefficient is neither here nor there. You know, some crimes don't get solved. 78% of burglaries in Dorset, for example, or something like that. But that doesn't entitle one. Well, no, I won't say that. What I will say is that it would be unusual if everybody used that as their motive, suddenly to break down the consensus that you leave certain things to the structures of the state.
I think there's no doubt that when Leviathan functions effectively, people are happy to leave justice in the hands of the state. The scenarios where personal revenge comes back on the agenda as a moral option, I think is only when Leviathan cannot deliver. And I think the Mexican farmers who had been terrorized, killed, had their limbs broken by the cartel is perhaps a better example of when taking justice into your own hands in the form of revenge is completely justifiable. There is a kind of state in Mexico, but its ability to deliver protection and justice to those farmers was severely limited and virtually non-existent. So they had to do it themselves or succumb to continued violence and oppression. So that I think is a less morally ambiguous scenario than the Death Wish films. I take your point on the Death Wish films because there's that crunch point. The police might have been able to use the evidence that he discovered to bring those people to justice, and then Leviathan would have been functioning effectively.
And he might have been wrong. I mean, he might have misinterpreted the evidence, and that's when professionals are quite useful.
Yes. So, I mean, that is an ambiguous, and I said here the moral ambiguity. I think with the Mexican farmers, it's far less ambiguous, and I think there is a strong case that they were right. It was in their moral purview to attack those cartel members who had been terrorizing them, killing them, maiming them, and so on. And it was a good thing. So I think whilst you're in a situation where Leviathan is functioning pretty well, then you are breaking the consensus and you could make some bad mistakes. But where there is a clear breakdown, then I think revenge comes back in as a morally justified option. I don't know if you want to come back on that one.
I was just, it's like a revolution against an alternative state. The cartels have created their own kind of apparatus.
Yeah, the gangster state, like the Nazis.
State, and then it's a counter-revolution, isn't it, rather than mass murder. I mean,
yeah. Okay. There's a lady at the back, I think,
yes,
wanted to come in.
To that one, I would say that it wasn't a counter-revolution, it was getting the status quo back. But to go back to the comments you were making about revenge versus the Leviathan justice, I just wanted to bring in the concept of restorative justice, which is a relatively new concept that's been piloted, I think, in the northeast of England and has had huge success rates. And that's where the perpetrator faces their victim. And the non-reoffending proportion is substantially higher than for where Leviathan justice on its own takes place. I don't want to guess at the statistics, I'm not good at remembering them, but it was about 4 times the amount.
Okay. Just a point of clarification. In those situations were the perpetrators not punished at all?
Well, this is a pilot scheme where, yes, they would normally have been punished, sent to prison. I believe that they were being held, and to a degree, the effect of their meeting the victim and how it was believed that they responded positively towards that kind of rehabilitation as to what the extent of the punishment thereafter would be.
It sounds a bit like your point about rehabilitation as well, that, you know, I see no problem with having that as a complementary strategy.
But it does address...
As a complete alternative, I have reservations.
Yeah, the point that you made very early on regarding disproportionate revenge.
It works on that because the perpetrator starts to understand the victim's perspective, and then they readjust their own understanding of the situation that they have created.
That's right.
Yeah.
And from the victim's perspective, when they see that and the regret, they're more willing to let the penalty be lower.
That sounds like a great way forward. You're not letting the people off. On the other hand, you're not punishing them to the extent that the victim's exaggerated perception of the crime would itself generate. I was reminded of it's an old book now, really the 1960s, called The Roots of Evil, a history of crime and punishment. In one of the early chapters, the author outlined a system that the Anglo-Saxons had. They didn't have a kind of Leviathan like a modern state, but they developed a range of norms to deal with crimes, largely based on a fine system. So if you chopped somebody's ear off, it was 1 gold piece. If you chopped off their hand, it was 10 gold pieces. If you broke their nose, it was half a gold piece, and so on and so forth. So they had this quite extensive list that had a fair amount of social agreement about it, so that you could go to the kind of village elders and say, what's it broke my nose? I've got 2 witnesses here, okay, 2 gold pieces or whatever it is, and everybody thought that was a fair kind of arrangement. It does seem there's a little bit of that also in this, what did you call it again? Restorative justice. Is there a bit of overlap there, or not?
I don't know. That's more like a pricing up, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a restoring of something to the.
But yes, it's an acknowledgement that you're going to get something back. That might settle for this.
Can I add to that briefly?
Yeah, of course.
That does happen in Dorset, and the idea is to reduce reoffending rather than to reduce the punishment. So it's to stop reoffending on a crime.
Right. Okay. Great.
I'll also make a comment on the mental health.
Yes.
Psychopath hasn't got a mental health problem that can be rehabilitated.
No.
Read John Ronson and look at the Bob Hare test for psychopathy.
Though psychopathy isn't always or even predominantly criminal. I forget his first name, but his surname is Dutton. Is it Philip Kevin Dutton? The Wisdom of Psychopaths. I've read quite a bit on psychopathy and almost psychopathy and so on, and it's mostly been largely negative with regard to psychopaths. But Kevin Dutton's book goes a long way towards rehabilitating them, and I would recommend you read it if you're interested in that area. The Wisdom of Psychopaths.
Okay, Sally's been waiting, and Phil's hand has gone up, and Simon as well. So 3, and if we can try to move things on fairly swiftly, because we've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Yes, I was wanting to make 2 comments, if I could. First, if Ronnie's worried about the ethical situation of going and gloating about his new success after his humble beginnings or whatever, surely the thing to do is not to gloat. I mean, it's just to enjoy the success and think, well, I can happily forgive the original offender because the good result has been that I've got this success. And if the offender happens to find out about it later and is upset, then that's it's his own selfish jealousy is its own punishment, really. But you don't have to rub his nose in it. You just go be successful.
But part of the issue is that the gloating is part of the revenge. That's part of the satisfaction. Now, of course, you could tone that down, and there are good reasons for thinking that might be a more successful way forward. Whether the gloating is itself immoral or bad, I think is still a bit of a moot point.
Yeah.
Also, like to point out, this is just a fictional situation.
Oh, of course. I know. Right. Oh, I'm aware.
Oh, we thought it was real.
Being successful, really.
But you had a second point.
Yes. The second thing was to go back to your thing about being transplant donors.
Oh yes, yes.
Your idea that you
I'm
have
glad
to.
you came up on that one.
You should have to sort of buy into the scheme in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, there's no reason why you shouldn't perhaps say that people have to sign up to the possibility of being donors, perhaps, but realistically, an awful lot of the people who receive donor organs or just donor blood or whatever, I'm a blood donor myself, they're never going to be in a position to donate organs because the injury, the illness that they've got makes them ineligible as donors. Now you could, and of course there are children as well, you could say, right, well the parents of the children have got to sign up to be donors, or at any rate establish the principle that they are in principle donors, they're not in practice, but it's not going to work on a simple level. I mean, there are a lot of people who can sign up knowing that they won't ever have to be donors because their organs are unsuitable for donation.
I see no problem with that. It is definitely a complicated situation that's not where the solutions aren't going to come easily. I don't think the solutions are impossible to achieve, while still also requiring, let's say, adults to sign up for the scheme if they want to be a recipient. Otherwise, you're going to have fewer donors because people think, well, there's nothing stopping free rider. And extensive free riding is bad in the long term for society, so we should do whatever we can to discourage it while still allowing, children and people who are never going to donate their organs to be recipients as well. That's the kind of broad line I would take. But again, going back to this, rational, informed discussion, I popped it in as an example because I think this is one of the kinds of things that humanists should discuss. In fact, I contacted Humanists UK and asked them what their position was on organ donation, and it was basically everybody, we support it regardless of whether you subscribe to the scheme or not. And I thought that was a mistake, and that's one of the reasons I popped it in this evening for a humanist audience, because your national organisation holds a view different from...
I'm actually surprised at that, because the last time I saw something about it, they were actually supporting the new scheme whereby you have to opt out. Yes. You're automatically in the scheme and you have to opt out. I thought Humanists UK actually support that change.
Oh, right, okay. But I may have misunderstood what they said then. It does happen.
Well, an eye for an eye is a good old-fashioned principle, isn't it? Yeah, maybe two eyes for an eye.
Just on a little note, in France it is you're automatically in the donors register unless you opt out, and you have to have the certificate if you opt out for your parents.
But the question then is, if you opt out, are you still eligible to receive organs?
Yes, you are.
Well, you see, that is an invitation to free riding. I'll opt out but be a recipient.
But at the moment we're all free riders, aren't we, unless we are actually signed up to the scheme, so...
Yes.
So you'd have to tick the box here in the UK. to be in the...
No, we're not free riders if we're signed up to the scheme.
No.
We're free riders if we opt out,
No.
because we get the benefits of those who donate.
But at the moment we have to actually take the step of signing the card or whatever. Unless we do that, we're all free riders.
But no, we're not. It's only if you opt out that you become a free rider. So what you're saying is, I want to be a free rider, so I'm opting out. I'll be a receiver, but I won't be a giver. I remember after I'd been at university for
you don't have to opt out at present. You're looking at the future situation.
Yeah.
Because at present, we are automatic. You're not required to give a donation unless you've opted in.
Yeah.
So you're looking at the potential situation.
Yes, it's a government proposal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try and get two more in if we can. So Phil at the back and then Simon. So let's do Phil first. We'll try and get to Simon before the end.
Thanks. Okay, I'll try and make it quick then. I'm very interested in this game theory thing that Axelrod did with the tit for tat winning. But we've been switching backwards and forwards between this pure idea of the game theory and all the complicated human things. Now, I'm trying to link the two together a little bit. So, tit for tat was very successful, and I've forgotten the thing that you said later. I remember now. There's this thing about it going unstable later when the population changes. Isn't it the case that in a nice Leviathan society like we presumably think we live in here rather than Mexico, that's something that smooths out the instability by making a consistent response of the state, like a tit for tat or some correct strategy. So I think that's an argument for supporting the Leviathan, not taking your own revenge, not allowing people to have their own strategies at all. In fact, stamping on their strategies and just enforcing a state-based tit for tat. But then something that the lady at the back said, talking about restorative justice, made me think that the whole game theory thing is much too simplified, because what we're really trying to do in real society is change people's strategies. We're not trying to play people's strategies off against each other and assuming that they're always going to be the same. We're trying to make sure that somebody doesn't reoffend, and so they don't have the same strategy next time they come round to an opportunity to carry out a crime. And that's a much more complicated thing, which I don't know if anybody's ever modelled that. If you put strategies into a computer and somehow they learn from their experience of fighting with other strategies and change their strategy to something different.
There's probably people working on that now, and they may even have succeeded. I thought your first point was essentially the same point that John was making, which is if you've got a pretty successfully functioning Leviathan, then personal revenge is likely to be detrimental to society as a whole, and there's a good chance it will be disproportionate and immoral. So when Leviathan is functioning reasonably well, then personal revenge is off the agenda. My point was that in many countries, Leviathan isn't working particularly well. And therefore we cannot take revenge off the agenda, and I think the Mexican farmers give us a good example.
Okay, possibly, but you don't want to be encouraging people in a society like ours where it might just not be quite as good as we would like it to be. We don't want people to think, well, that's a good excuse to take everything into our own hands and take over from what the state should be doing.
I agree, and my purpose in raising the whole issue this evening to an audience of humanists is simply that we have been encouraged by a prominent humanist to abandon revenge altogether as something that is unhumanist. And I don't think it is unhumanist. I think circumstances determine the extent to which we as humanists disavow revenge or actually embrace or commend it. It's not a universal, and certainly Mexican humanists would probably support the farmers rather than Philip Nathan.
Okay, let's get to Simon, and then I think that will have to be the last one.
I was impressed with the game theory ideas that you were putting forward.
Steven Pinker did it, not me.
Yes. I was thinking that when I was at school, I was taught about Christianity by the school chaplain, and what he said is, the essence of Christianity is that you don't worry about yourself at all. You just devote yourself to service to other people. You eliminate yourself. Stop being selfish completely. And it struck me at the time as a rather unrealistic approach to life, because it was just sort of telling half the story but not the other half. And it seems to lead into pacifism on the international stage, where you say, well, we will never go to war because war is such a bad thing, it's a crime, so we'll just never do it. And that seems to me unrealistic. Oh, have I touched something on the... Hang on. Is that working? Yeah, it's working. So I think pacifism is unrealistic, although obviously there's another extreme where countries sort of start wars and stuff, so it's finding some kind of a balance. But I just wondered that if people think that in many spheres that pacifism is not a sensible approach, does it also mean that the Christianity that many of us have been brought up with is not as sensible as the kind of humanism that you're talking about? Is it essentially an argument for the kind of humanism you're talking about as opposed to the traditional view of Christianity?
I think pacifism for humanists is misguided. I think pacifism for Christians is probably not, because if there really is a powerful, loving, just God who's in control of everything, then you follow the words of the Lord's Prayer and say, not my will but thine be done. You don't need to take control of things, you don't need to implement policies or anything, because God's in control of everything. So it makes perfect sense in the context of the existence of a God of that kind. If as humanists we reject any kind of supernatural entity, then it seems to me pacifism is a bit like always cooperate strategy in Axelrod's games, and you're going to be gobbled up by always defect.
Yes, if I can take the mic.
We've got a schools team meeting on Sunday, and I was reading in the minutes today about the last meeting. There was a question. We get asked various questions by students in schools, and one of the ones that comes up from time to time is what do humanists think about capital punishment? So we've given a lot of food for thought with that tonight, Peter.
Show of hands.
Pardon?
Show of hands on that.
Yeah, exactly. So to help me, next time that question is thrown at me by 300 school children, I would like to find out tonight from this representative sample of humanists, if some of you may not identify as humanists, but anyway, you're in a humanist meeting, so you get a vote tonight. So could I just...
Is that all right, Peter?
Could I just ask...
I love it.
Those of you who would say, as a humanist, you would actually support the, let's say, the reintroduction of capital punishment. So hands up those of you who would support
context,
it. Pardon?
We need a brief context.
No context at all. Just if this was on a manifesto, you would say yes. If it was a referendum on this question, you would say yes. Bring back capital punishment. Hands up, those of you who
for illegal parking.
Well, no, for serious crimes.
Serious crimes.
Yes, like murder, that kind of thing. Okay, two, and those of you who would, three, yeah, and those of you who would say no, you wouldn't. Okay, so now I can tell the school kids what.
Or humanists.
Small minority.
That's really helpful.
A very swift comment, and I'm saying no because Leviathan very often gets things wrong.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
But in cases where it didn't, would you support capital punishment?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we could go on and on with this, couldn't we? I think, Peter, it's been a really fascinating evening, and lots of food for thought there. Thank you so much for all the effort you've put into it. I think we need to get either a recording or a transcript of this up to Philip Nathan in Durham so that he can respond.
Well, you can send in my notes, David.
Yes,
I'll email it to him.
I'm sure he would be very interested, and no doubt he will adjust his principles accordingly. Okay, will you please give Peter a little big round of applause?